Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe for multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and many other sectors.
Hello and welcome to our special coverage, 10 years of Modinomics. We are counting down to the budget, an interim one on the 1st of February, followed by the big one, a full budget in July. But what is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 10th budget likely to be? And more importantly, as we look back, how has the central budget performed as far as subsidies are concerned? Because the big debate around the level of subsidies that are being borne both by the centre and states continues. And to discuss that, I am joined by two very prominent guests, Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at the Bank of Baroda, and R Jagannathan, one of India's most noted journalists. He is the Editorial Director of the Swarajya magazine. Welcome to both of you. And before I start with both of you, I just want to bring up on screen a chart that we just saw a quick glimpse of, and that kind of paints the picture as far as the total subsidy bill is concerned. And we have this from FY17 onwards. There is other data that we will bring up on the screen, but take a look at this. The subsidy to GDP ratio, a peak in FY21, obviously as a consequence of COVID, then tapering off and expected to moderate as we go forward. This is one of the expectations that Elara Securities has put out. There are other estimates, including by the State Bank of India, which has said that FY25, the central government's subsidy expenditure is expected to be at 6.5%. This is over the absolute number of 48.9 lakh crore in FY24 budget estimate, and there is expectation that the subsidy bill will be capped, but capex is continue to grow at least at 15%. And among other expectations, very quickly, this one again from Elara Capital, the budget expectations of the FY20 estimated subsidy at 1.4%. Remember that chart where we said that it would taper off a bit, and the expectation of new expenses amid pre-election spending. And the big expectation, Kisan Samman Nidhi, a hike by some estimates to 3,000 rupees per individual eligible farmer. This would add up to 30,000 crore additional burden, and more allocations for poor, women, unemployed, higher Manrega funds. This is a story that we have been repeating, that in the current year itself 47% increase over the budget estimate on Manrega spending, and possible hike in insurance schemes for the rural poor. And before I go to my guests, one quick additional point to consider for those who believe that the interim budget is only likely to be a pure vote on account. Remember, in 2019, among other things, there was an increase in the exemption limit for income tax up to 5 lakh rupees, and that was also the occasion when the farmer scheme was started. But to you, Mr. Jagannathan, the big picture of 10 years of Modinomics on the subsidy front, how would you describe 10 years of Modinomics with regard to subsidies and spending?
One thing, the biggest single achievement of this government is how it has streamlined and stopped the leakages in the whole subsidy system, which is actually, if you look at it, it's gigantic, given the sheer amount of money the government spent in terms of lakhs of crores, which you have just put the numbers some time back. So I would say that using the JAM trio, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, this thing has been completely streamlined. So I would say that is why you're seeing the declining trend after thing. Because one thing that Mr. Modi's philosophy is that he does not believe in unmitigated giving of freebies. I mean, which is why he's also been talking about revdi culture and all that. He has of course done some of his own stuff, but he is doing it within limits, with keeping fiscal thing in mind, which is why you see when the whole world is suffering after COVID by overspending, India is the only man standing when it comes to fiscal rectitude. Okay, and that's largely because the subsidy scheme was given when it was really needed, that is in 21 and 2022, and after that, in order to make it politically easy for the shift away from giving free fruit gain during COVID, he made the Food Security Act food free. So I think he's done it brilliantly, managed subsidies both economically and politically, and I would say he needs to be deeply commended for that.
Mr. Jagannathan, that's a good point. Just one more point before I go to Madan Sabnavis. The extension of the free food scheme covers almost 814 million beneficiaries, which is many nations put all together, and 12 lakh crore expenditure estimated, obviously at current prices by the Ministry of Finance, beginning the 1st of January, spread over 5 years. Would you say that this is now a scheme which is basically cast in stone and is unlikely to ever be rolled back?
Yeah, at least in the next 2 years, I don't see it being rolled back, but some kind of limits might be put, or you can have some nominal price of 1 rupee a kilo or something for anything you draw from the scheme, from the food grain scheme. Might happen after 1 or 2 years, but not certainly during the election season this year and the next, where there are very, very major political considerations. So my guess is the direction of this year's subsidy may be more towards petroleum and other things, but food grain is sort of frozen for the next at least 2-3 years.
Okay. Madan, the first answer that Mr. Jagannathan gave and the commendation that he offered to Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his government, your thoughts on that?
Actually, Siddharth, if you look at it, the fact that the government has stated that it's providing free food to 800 million people, it means that 800 million people actually do require it. So there's a high level of deprivation which is there in the country. I think that is something which has been established because even the government refers to 800 million people as poor people. Now, let's just look at the Niti Aayog report, which spoke about multidimensional poverty. If I remember right, that ratio has actually come down over 10 years from 29% to 11%. No? Now, the dimensions which are looked at, surprisingly, they don't look at income. I think most of them are in terms of having access to water, electricity, housing, nutrition, education, health. A lot of this has actually been financed by the government, both the center as well as the states. So I think that's one of the reasons as to why we have this anomaly in our country, where we have a large number of poor people, yet they are not multidimensionally poor because a lot of these facilities have been provided by the government, which is coming through the budgets. So therefore, I think subsidies is something which are valued, and I think it's absolutely essential. And what Mr. Jagannathan was saying, I think what has happened over the last 10 years is that the whole thing has been sharpened. There is a DBT of making sure that we're not getting fake beneficiaries, and the ones who actually deserve it have gotten the benefit. But going ahead, I think since the country is not able to create enough jobs which create sustainable income, there will be greater pressure on the government to continue providing these kind of benefits to the government. Because just think of it. I have access to gas. Maybe I'm getting it free of cost. Tomorrow, in case I have to pay the market price, I will probably revert to using firewood or kerosene or whatever other the alternative fuel is. So I think this is going to be the major challenge for budgeting when you're going ahead. Right now, if you look at it, because we have a high fiscal deficit, we are still borrowing 6%, maybe 5.5% of our GDP is being borrowed. You are having enough funds to fund both capex as well as the so-called social welfare. But going ahead, when we go to the 3% fiscal deficit mark, 5 trillion economy, I cannot having a fiscal deficit of 15-16 lakh crores. I come down to 12 lakh crores. How do I actually manage two of them? I think that is when the challenge will really come forward.
Madan, one of the points that many people offer, especially the political side of the argument, they say that as India's economy grows, its ability at the exchequer level to continue to run a large subsidy program, and we have those numbers, 10 years of Modinomics from counting from FY14 onwards right up till FY24, the budget estimates, and you see the amount and how it has gone up. There was a very, very sharp increase in FY21 at almost 7,60,000 crore, which has tapered off to around 4 lakh odd crore. So, Madan, would you buy that argument that as India grows, as our base expands, GDP expands, our ability to provide these subsidies and to use that famous phrase, revenues, at the state and the central level also consequently grows. So, we should be fine with it given the size of the poor population in our country.
No, absolutely. I think if there's enough buoyancy which is there in the economy, then definitely there'll be greater amount of resources which can be garnered through your taxes. But we should remember one thing, that most of the economies which have gotten through GST collection, for example, would get exhausted at some point of time. So to my mind, a large part of this is being financed through the fiscal deficit, what we are borrowing, which is absolutely essential. I'm all for subsidies. I'm all for saying that if the people require, the job of the government is to protect the poor first, and then you bring in the capex. Capex actually is a job of the private sector, not of the government. But because we are having this kind of a large fiscal deficit, large borrowing program, you're able to meet both the commitments without any problems. As I highlighted earlier, the moment we get down to 4.5%, 3% of fiscal deficit, I may not be having that kind of resources. And if my tax revenues don't grow at an exponential rate, then there would be a problem. Because today are talking of 12, 13% growth in taxes, which is commensurate with what's happening in nominal GDP, is something which will keep the system going. The contradiction will come only at a point of time when we see a plateauing of the growth in tax revenue, in which case you will have to look at alternate sources. Of course, I think the government has done fairly well on asset sale. Maybe there would be other resources which would come in, but I think it'll get a bit more complex as we go ahead. As long as I'm sticking to this 5% fiscal deficit mark, I think we have enough resources. But once I get to 3%, that's when we could be having problems of balancing the two.
Mr. Jagannathan, one of the highlights of what is clearly a momentous day in our civilizational history, which is the Pran Pratishtha of the Lord Ram temple. In the evening, Prime Minister Modi launched a new solar access scheme. My question to you is it necessary to do specific schemes in this regard, or just continue to provide budgetary support to the existing solar program? Or should we see this from the lens of, politics and the necessities of an election year, Mr. Jagannathan?
I think you have to do both. I think you must have one policy-driven broad umbrella which promotes renewable energy use everywhere and anywhere. On the other hand, you have very specific things that come from the fact that in the next thing, UP and the Hindi belt are going to play a huge role in how the BJP fares in terms of reaching its target of having a majority of its own once more. So, and a lot of the political and economic stability of the last 10 years has come because one party actually had the majority. So if that were to change in the next elections, it would be a huge tragedy economically, regardless of whether you support Mr. Modi or not. That's the point. So I think what Mr. Modi has done is he's managed both the politics and the economics rather well. Whereas during the UPA, what you saw a lot of the politics being managed, but the economics went completely under, especially in UPA 2. There was one major crisis, which was the global financial crisis, but they managed to mess it up in the second half of their tenure. Whereas here there have been three major crises. You have had the COVID crisis, then now you had the Ukraine and Israel wars and all kinds of things. And I don't think the UPA in this situation would have managed well. So I think it is important that the political authority manages politics and economics in a balanced way, because if you don't balance the politics with the economics or vice versa, you're going to have fiscal disaster.
Mr. Jagannathan, to continue with that point, this hugely emotive event, and I think millions of Indians wept and many more millions participated in it. But that same evening, to follow that up with one more subsidy scheme, what is the political signal or political imperative there?
I think the thing is, you're just 2 months away from the first ballot being cast. So I don't think you can after all, the whole February 2019 budget was not an interim budget. It was almost like a 3/4 or a half budget, where there were very major fiscal things announced.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
So you are not going to get, let me tell you, this government has done something interesting by moving the budget date to February 1, it has ensured that it stays out of the model code of conduct window. So you can actually present nearly a half budget, at least as far as the voters are concerned, because I don't expect this to be a thing. So this government has a unique ability to present 5.5 budgets instead of just 5 and 1 interim.
Absolutely. And since you made a mention of 2019, Mr. Jagannathan, Madan, those announcements, at least the three top ones by in our reckoning, the PM Kisan Samman Nidhi, the income up to 5 lakh being exempted, and the Shram Yogi Mandhan scheme for unorganized sectors. So just three, and one could add subsequently even off-budget items like that big corporate tax rate cut which happened subsequently. But I come to the broader point once again, which Mr. Jagannathan has touched upon. What are your own expectations from this interim budget? Because we believe, the markets at least believe, Madan, and you will agree with me, that a third term of Prime Minister Modi is a certainty. They are responding in a certain way, and therefore they believe that policy will be a continuum from the interim budget into the full budget as well.
No, absolutely. I think that is more a foregone conclusion that there will be continuity as far as the politics is concerned. But I think the FM has made it very clear that we should not be expecting anything dramatic. Now, when you're talking of 2019, we should remember that we just emerged from a drought. And therefore, even though the elections are not really announced, you can still make certain kind of announcements in the interim budget in case there are compelling conditions. But today, since the Indian economy is doing very well, I think as a matter of prudence, the FM has also mentioned saying that don't expect anything dramatic. So I think it will be a case of continuation. But this should not stop them from increasing allocations. Now, we should be careful while interpreting numbers, because when the budget size was 45 lakh crores and it goes to say 50 lakh crores, which is announced, it's but natural that most of the schemes will also be seeing a commensurate increase taking place. So that should not be interpreted as saying that it's being done specially because there are elections in mind, because all the programs, all the expenditures are going to increase by a certain amount. And depending on the priorities of the government, if I want to spend more on housing and probably less on Narega, those numbers can always be allocated. But I do not think there's going to be any major new scheme. There could be some bit of articulation which can give you a sense that maybe there is something new coming about. But I think the prudent part will be followed more on the case of saying that let's try and make sure that we move the fiscal deficit towards the 4.5% number. The internals, I think, will automatically get adjusted once we're looking at the fiscal deficit moving, say, from 5.9 to 5.25, 5.5, anything, whatever it is, whatever the government chooses, because ultimately we have to reduce this gap by 1.4% from 5.9 to 4.5 in 2 years. So they will have to split it up between the 2 years.
Mr. Jagannathan, if not in the interim budget, but certainly in the full budget, is it time for the government of India, Prime Minister Modi's government, and who also be the finance minister at that time, to articulate a new FRBM vision? Because some elements of the FRBM, and you will agree with me, come from a different era, different thinking, and obviously a different size of India's economy, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that the old 3% target for fiscal deficit is probably a little too ambitious and it might never be achieved, because I think we are now looking at more like 3.5, 4 as the new bottom around below which we can't go. So FRBMs unfortunately have always been too overly flexible, because the government introduces it as part of the budget platter, and before you know, nobody even discusses it. I mean, it's never discussed in parliament, if at all, In fact, most people do not discuss it and don't care about it. It's only economists, maybe Madan and me and you might discuss it here in this kind of programs, but by and large in politics, the FRBM has had no significance, and more or less I think the constraint operates more strongly at the state level than at the central level. I think the next finance commission will have to probably make some changes where states get slightly more leeway to spend. And because see, already more than 60 or 65% of tax resources are at the state level. It is probably necessary to do some of that. A growing economy will ease those concerns, but I think some change will have to happen there. And an FRBM needs to be far more, let's say, as a guideline, and not just something that you can keep changing every year according to your political or economic circumstances. I think we need some kind of a trajectory that is sensible and yet takes note of the fact that, see, just like India is becoming a very large economy, which means its ability to borrow internally without creating too much inflation is improving. I mean, which is what like Japan is doing for 30 years, and they never had inflation till recently because of the supply chain disruptions. So my point is, once you have a very large domestic base of lenders, whether through banks or through direct, in fact, you can borrow even more if you actually borrow more directly, which is what is not happening on a large scale. Right now, you're borrowing through banks, through the SLR route, which is actually, whereas if you look at mainline interest rates elsewhere, what you're getting on yields on central government securities over long term are pretty good. 7% and not for 10 years is a good rate for something that's practically default proof, So I think we have not tapped the limits of domestic borrowing because the retail participation is pretty low. So my guess is a higher level of fiscal deficit is sustainable, but not, you can't go let it go through the roof again.
That's right. Madan, your own expectations with regard to what is most essential for the interim budget to speak about, not just the signals, but in terms of specific numbers, what will you be looking forward to?
See, actually, the numbers which we're looking forward to are number one, what kind of forecasts are made, or what kind of assumptions are made on GDP growth. I think because one of the reasons why we had this advanced estimates of GDP for 24, which came out, it's quite ridiculous that you do everything based on 2 quarters. But I think the whole purpose is that you have some kind of a base on the basis of which the budget can be formulated, because you make certain projection of what will your GDP growth be. So accordingly, we'll be able to know what kind of inflation forecast, what kind of real GDP forecast is the government talking of. That's number one. Two, I think the fiscal deficit or the fiscal deficit route which the government is taking, I think that is going to be another thing which is going to be of interest. Third would be, of course, what would be the capital expenditure, because there's still a lot of heavy lifting being done by the central government, because states tend to cut back on capex in case they're breaching their FRBM norms on fiscal deficit. So I think that will be another number which we'll be looking at. And the last one, I think, is the disinvestment, because I've always looked at the disinvestment numbers as a kind of a residual number. And we have seen that the success has been quite limited in the current financial year. And I think in the next year, there could probably be more focus on asset sale rather than divestment, because we should remember by the time the new budget comes in, though I believe the same numbers will be retained even there, but action actually starts after July. You may not be having that much of time to go in with a full-fledged disinvestment program.
Madan, I just want to follow up on the disinvestment point. One of the first assignments that Mr. Jagannathan, as the then editor of the Financial Express, my first job in journalism, had put me on, was to go and meet Mr. G.V. Ramakrishnan, the head of the Divestment Commission, in a very fancy room on the first floor of North Block. Disinvestment has not had a similar room afterwards. One of the things that people in the finance ministry now say that analysts and reporters like me should stop talking about disinvestment, because they say the pipeline seems to have run dry. Look more at dividends, because how much there is very little to disinvest. For example, Air India, which the government took a significant burden of future liabilities. Now, I'm not going to even mention companies in the telecom space. So, is disinvest something that we all should now look beyond and focus more on monetization of some of the massive infrastructure assets that have been created, Madan?
No, I agree with you, Siddharth, because if you see, all the low-hanging fruits have already been plucked. Now, whatever decisions we take from now onwards, it's going to be difficult to implement. It's not going to be that easy. There will be a lot of ideology which comes also in the way. So I think looking at asset monetization, that is asset sale, is something which probably makes more sense. And I think the government will progressively rely more on it. It's less controversial. It's something which can be easily done. But the only issue is that normally when you talk of asset monetization, if it's a PSU asset which is being monetized, normally it will be going into the coffers of the PSU rather than the budget. So there would be a technical issue which will have to be sorted out. But given the fact that in the last budget, I think they've kept 10,000 crores as part of asset monetization, this particular number will probably increase in the coming years.
Mr. Jagannathan, the name of the department was changed to Department of Investment and Public Asset Management. You will also remember there was something that was announced, the National Asset Monetization Pipeline. And many of these things perhaps are still work in progress. Is there a new deal that the government should offer, if not on 1st February, but later during the year, with regard to how it proposes to invest and retain its shareholding?
Yeah, my thing is like, see, in the last 1 year when the markets were booming, I'm surprised that most banks, public sector banks, raised debt rather than equity, even though they were government holding was far above the 51% limit. So my point is, if you don't raise equity at a time when the prices are favorable to you, and you raise 81 capital and other long-term bonds and other things, I think it is a mistake. I think they should have raised a lot more equity, because in most banks the government holding is far above 51%. That is one. Secondly, there is also asset monetization is going to be very critical, because the theme song of Modi's last 9 years has been investment, investment, investment in infrastructure. This infrastructure is now ripe for divestment or participation by the private sector. That's one way to do divestment without necessarily privatizing anything fully, right? And the last thing I think I need to say, which you didn't ask me, but I have a feeling Modi does not fundamentally believe in the concept of privatization. I remember we had an interaction with him in 2013, and we asked him about what does he think about privatization. He said that, like, look, you got to fix the problem there so that they perform better. In Gujarat, what he did, he mentioned, right? So that is what is the singular biggest change here is our public sector units are mostly doing very well, starting mainly with banks. They've been recapitalized, they are performing well, they are far more closer to the customer, and they're doing very well. Their net bad loans are at the lowest level in a decade. So, and also say other areas, the Atmanirbhar Bharat is actually helping a lot of other sectors in the heavy steel sector, construction and defense to really boom. So we are seeing a rebuilding of value within the public sector. So as Madan said, I think a large part of the divestment thing has been replaced with a investment philosophy, which is why the department is changed. And the government's disinvestment earnings will partly be replaced by higher dividend payment, even if it is demanded at the point of a gun from North Block.
Absolutely, and in fact, since you spoke about Prime Minister Modi's views on privatization, I am reminded of what a former railway man who was heading our airline company once said to me. He said that he does not believe in privatization, he believes in expanding the asset. But Mr. Jagannathan, speculative question, but do you think that in the third term, Prime Minister Modi may want to bite the bullet on Bharat Sanchar and Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Limited?
I don't think so, because he believes that certain core assets in very critical sectors need to be in the public sector. In fact, I fear that he might have to end up having to take over one more private sector telecom company that's called Vodafone Idea, because that's struggling to, even though the share prices have gone up, but its debts are so huge, even after the equity conversion of a part of the dues, it is actually doesn't look sustainable at all, because this sector is likely to remain a duopoly with the government offering third option. And VI will either ultimately have to be absorbed by one of the two big companies, or the government will have to think of taking it over temporarily, putting it back on rails and then selling it. Something like that might have to be done. I mean, this has never been done before, where a bad company was taken over and then sold after a very long time. But in the case of Vodafone, I think it just might need to be done.
That clearly a telecom new deal might be something that will be discussed. Madan, one of the other things that I want to, as we conclude this discussion, focus the attention of our viewers on is your own sense with regard to capital expenditure. The massive announcements that we have seen in the past, and there have been a string, a bit of them sometimes also overlap in terms of reconfiguration. But your own sense about the approach that the Modi government is likely to adopt for infrastructure development going forward. We've seen some signs of tapering off in sector-specific allocations. Do you think that's a broader theme?
No, not really. I think it will all be dependent upon what kind of a budget size we're looking at, what kind of borrowings we're looking at, and probably also what we're going to do in terms of social welfare. So last year we had something like 10 lakh crores, which was budgeted, of which 1 lakh crores was transferred to the states. So I think the states will also take credit for that actual expenditure which takes place. So I think the number of 10 may go up to maybe 11.5 to 12 lakh crores. So we're actually penciling in 45 lakh crores budget increasing to around 50 lakh crores. So out of the 5 lakh crores, maybe around 1.5 to 2 lakh crores would be dedicated for capital expenditure. And if we continue in the same areas, primarily in roads, followed by railways. I think these could be the two pet themes, because they do have very strong backward linkages, which we have seen with sectors like steel and cement, which are also seeing an increase in investment. In fact, private investment is fairly buoyant in sectors in the private sector, which are linked to what the government is doing on the capex front.
One final question to you, Mr. Jagannathan, the last one on the show today. What is Modinomics likely to be all about in the third term, which many people expect is an absolute done deal?
Yeah, I expect that there will be a balance between the additional spends in social safety nets and in infrastructure. But I expect one major challenge that will get addressed is the cleaning up of the GST system in terms of lower rates and wider coverage. You know, in the last 10 years, we've been happy with the fact that the revenues have been growing, but the potential with the current regime is probably limited purely on the compliance factor. You now need to address both the demand challenge and the expansion of the GST net challenge, and rationalization, inverted duty structures. These have all been slowly postponed here and there repeatedly. Now, after the election, this can be one thing that they can address very strongly, and I hope it happens.
Absolutely, Mr. Jagannathan, and perhaps there are many other items that will need to be addressed, but for the immediate moment, broad consensus here, viewers, from Mr. Jagannathan and Madan Sabnavis, and a smattering of other points of view that we have shown through the last 30 minutes. This will on paper be an interim budget, but as Mr. Jagannathan pointed out, because the date is 1st February and not the 28th of February in an election cycle year, do expect certain elements that target the masses and make this a continuum towards what will officially be the full budget in July, and we'll be back at that time as well. For now, Mr. Jagannathan and Madan Sabnavis, thank you very much for your time with us today. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of 10 Years of Modinomics. We'll be back tomorrow with more, right up till the budget and on budget day as well. Do stay tuned in, offer your comments, do like, share and subscribe to Business Today Television. I'll see you again. Until then, goodbye.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe from multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines and many other sectors.
In today's rapidly evolving business environment, when risk is omnipresent, managing risks is no longer just about ticking a few boxes. Businesses need to maintain a panoramic view of risks to stay ahead of the curve. Join us to explore how organizations can rethink risk to unlock new possibilities and become fit for future. At PwC presents De-Risking the Future in collaboration with Business Today. Celebrate 32 years of leadership in business news with Business Today. From the groundbreaking AI cover of Sundar Pichai to PM Modi's exclusive on G20, we redefine headlines. Now our 32nd anniversary issue explores India 2029, the 5-year agenda, with industry titans sharing exclusive insights. So, just BT it for unparalleled perspectives. Business Today, 32 years of leadership, innovation and business brilliance. Subscribe now.